In just a few moments, we're going to baptize another least of these. We are going to baptize Gabriel James Larson. And I recognize, as many of you do in this church, that this is my first infant baptism to do in this church. And it happens to be for my executive assistant's grandchild. Now, you don't have to be my executive assistant for me to baptize one of your children, but it's a privilege for me, and I'm thankful to be able to do it. But I recognize as well, it's the first opportunity for me to tell you just a few thoughts of why we do such things in this church. Honest questions, okay? Will this baptism save this child eternally? Please say no. Will this baptism guarantee that this child will become an adult Christian? The answer is still what? Still no. So why do we do this? I mean, the water is just water. It's not guaranteeing anything. Faith is from the heart, not an outward act. We do this, however, not just for sentiment, though this is a sweet baby, not just for tradition, though churches through the ages have done this. We do this because we believe it's what the Bible teaches, and not just our tradition. Some reasons. Throughout biblical history, God has said He would work in covenant relationships. You may remember that's why He said to Abraham, to whom faith had been credited as righteousness, that he was to extend a covenant sign not only to himself, but to his children, those in his household. And Abraham did that before the children could even believe, because it was a sign of the pledge of God, not just of the individual's faith, of the pledge of God, that when the conditions of the covenant were met, that is faith, when the conditions of the covenant were met, that God pledged, He would then honor the covenant. He would call that child His own once faith was expressed. The sign in the Old Testament was circumcision, but whereby there was a shedding of blood, indicating what ultimately would have to happen. Christ would have to shed blood, and it would be faith in what He did that made adults as well as children right with Him. But again, that sign was given to children because it was God's pledge, the visible mark upon them, that when they met the conditions, that His promises would apply. In the New Testament, the Apostle Peter, speaking 2,000 years after that covenant had been extended, said this, "The promise is to you and to your children and to them that are afar off, even as many as the Lord shall call." Again, here we are after Christ's resurrection, when the apostle is saying, the promise continues to parents and to their children, not to guarantee their children's salvation, but that when the conditions are met, that is faith, that God pledges He will be true to His word and will credit as righteousness the faith of that individual. That promise is extended in the sight of the church so that the church has a continuing visible witness to the world that we believe that God has pledged to us, to our children, to all who are afar off, that when faith is expressed, He will be true to His word and will extend His righteousness to those who believe in Him. Now, is it appropriate that that circumcision sign be administered through baptism? The Apostle Paul says explicitly in Colossians 2, to Christians, you are still circumcised, that is, you still have covenant signed, by baptism, and expresses that we are circumcised, indicated to be members of the covenant, now by the expression not of what blood would have to be shed, but by what the blood has accomplished, the washing away of sin, indicated by the water of baptism. Now we have to say, honestly, we know Bible-believing, dear brothers and sisters don't always read the Bible the same way, right? There are people who don't think that baptism should be administered to children. Why do we? Well, because for 2,000 years prior to Christ, the covenant sign had always been given to the children of believing parents. But they weren't believing themselves. Yes, they were not believing themselves yet. But the parents had the right to give the pledge of God, that visible sign, that when faith was expressed, then God would claim that child. Not a guarantee. It is simply a pledge of God that He would be true to His word for those who do express their faith. Well, Is there any evidence that that's in the New Testament? Many people ask, of course, where is the explicit verse that says we should baptize our children? Well, we ask precisely the opposite question. After 2,000 years of God saying to parents, you can give the visible mark of the covenant to your children. And then the apostle saying, the promise continues to you and to your children. And then every New Testament example of an adult baptism after the resurrection, the Bible saying not only was that adult baptized, who else was also baptized? He or her, their household. Every time, with one exception. The Ethiopian eunuch, who could have no household. Every other time, precisely the same wording that was applied to Abraham. You give the covenant sign to you and your household. That precise wording is used every time in the New Testament that there is a fully described adult baptism after the resurrection, except for the Ethiopian eunuch. We look for the verse that says, given all of that history of 2,000 years and the continuity, the covenant, and the expression of the apostles, and the examples of the New Testament, where is there a verse that says, do not do this? As I said, it's kind of the opposite question, because we believe that God does bless parents by saying, I promise to you that when this child expresses faith, the same promises that have been to you when you expressed your faith, those promises will be this child when this child expresses faith. So parent, what's your obligation? To explain the faith to your children, to live before them in a godly way so that they will early in life know what it means to express faith in Christ. No, the baptism doesn't guarantee that. But the baptism is part of the parent's own obedience to say, we believe what the Word says. We believe that when this child expresses faith, that God will be true to His Word and save this child eternally. One other little special blessing, some of you may remember it from 1 Corinthians 7. God says even to single parents, before their children can express their faith, even to those parents who alone express faith in a household, God says, your child is made holy by your faith. When we put water on this child, we are indicating two promises of God. Number one, until that child can express faith, the faith of the parent, even one, covers the child. 1 Corinthians 7. Two, the pledge of God, not to guarantee this child's salvation. This child still must commit faith to Christ. But when that child does, God says, when that day comes, I promise you, I will be true to my word. So when we baptize a child, we believe heaven looks on and God smiles and He says, here are faithful parents dedicating everything they have to me and saying, and I promise that as a consequence of what they do, when this child comes to faith, not a guarantee, but when by example and testimony and that child's own decision, this child comes to faith, I will be true to my word. Here's my mark on it. I will be true to my word. And that's what this baptism shows. Let me ask that the parents come forward. James and Sarah, as we now participate